Okay, so we're talking about the different kinds of laws, and we're talking about laws made by legislatures and laws made by the process of stare decisis or precedent. So when we have a contract dispute, for example, and go to court, and the lawyers argue the various rights issues with regard to the contract, they will refer to prior case law, unless there's some specific legislative law that's involved in determination of what the contract is about. And there's this whole history of English law and then American law in these case law books. And so you go to a law library and you have just tons and tons of books going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And you go to law school and you'll take a course in contracts, and you'll get this thick book, and it basically teaches you the ideas of contracts through teaching you cases where the basic ideas of contract law were discussed by judges in applying the law in specific cases of contract dispute between parties. So you have stare decisis or precedents in court cases as one kind of law, and then a second kind of law is you have the laws that the legislature enacts, which are rooted in some countries in a constitutional or higher agreement, you might say, among the people, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, etc., at the beginning of the Constitution. And then in addition to these two kinds of laws, legislative enactments and precedents of court cases, we have gosh, I forgot the word. Isn't that terrible? Happens to me all the time in these videos. Anyway, we have laws that are created by, that are regulation. Yes, that's the word, regulations. Now what happens? Well, the legislature can't cover all the details of what it needs the United States government to do with regard to the regulation of pharmaceutical drugs. So when it creates legislation regarding the regulation of pharmaceutical drugs, it turns over to that particular aspect of government responsible, say the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, or whatever FDA understands. The legislation grants powers that the legislature has to the FDA as a body to create regulations which can go into more detail following the guidance of the legislation. So then you have three kinds of laws. You have stare decisis or precedent laws that come from courts. You have legislative laws that come from legislative branches in accord with any limits set by the Constitution. And then you have regulation, which is done by government agencies that are empowered by the legislature to create regulations. So, for example, at the time that I'm creating this video, we're 100 days into the BP oil mess in the Gulf. And the big boogeyman is the regulatory agency that got too cozy with the oil companies and did not enforce its own rules or make the necessary inspections that it could have done under the regulatory authority granted this administrative body by the legislative branch. And as a result of this lax, then BP was able to avoid doing the best job that it could do and went for the most profitable, that is the cheapest way to approach their problems in drilling this well, and as a consequence, the cheapest way wasn't good enough in terms of the technology required, and you have the awful mess that happens. So you have these three different approaches, precedent and legislative law and regulatory law, and sometimes called administrative law if you go to law school. And all of these things can collide on a specific situation. You can have an individual who let's say, is manufacturing something, and he has a small manufacturing system, and he uses some kind of toxic materials in order to do his manufacturing. You know, they're useful in the manufacturing process, but he produces waste, and he has to dispose of the waste. Okay? And there'll be regulations about this activity. There will be contract relations he has between the people who buy his products and the people who provide him things. And there will be laws passed by the legislature governing all of this stuff. And if there's a court case, you know, there'll even be criminal laws, perhaps, if he violated criminal laws. Okay, so it's very complicated in a certain sense, this law business. And of course, when Steiner approached this, he tried to get us to recognize in his writings on the threefold social order that there were some fundamental underlying principles. So in the life of rights, the underlying principle is equality. And basically that ideal is in all of the processes by which law is generated and by which public life takes its course, which creates judges and regulators and legislators to do things with the law. And this principle of equality is manifested in the one man, one vote rule, and in democracies, where voting is a means by which all of this comes into being. And we have this idea that we're supposed to all be equal under the law. And in fact, you could say that there is a sort of higher law hidden in the background of this, which sometimes is talked about, and it's called the social contract. Because the fact is, and this was recognized by the writers of the Declaration of Independence, to have a society in which the rule of law is followed, there has to be consent on the part of people following the rule of law. That consists of the social contract. That is, we consent to being under the rule of law. And not everybody does that. There are people that are outlaws. They go outside the law. They don't follow the rule of law. Sometimes we call them criminals. Sometimes we call them senators. You know, people don't have to follow the rule of law. We have this society which puts a high value on the rule of law, and we have this understanding, which is the social contract, that we're going to follow the rule of law. But lots of people don't follow the rule of law for various reasons. People cheat on their taxes, and etc., etc., etc. But the basic idea of the rule of law, the basic element in the social contract, and the manifestations in practice of the different kinds of laws, the regulations and the legislative laws and the precedence laws developed by courts, all of this has woven within it this ideal of equality, that everybody should be treated the same. And this was Rudolf Steiner's observation, that the law involves and public life involves this idea of everybody being treated the same. Now, he said this because he distinguished the economic life and or the economic sphere from the rights sphere, and the cultural life having different principles. So if we go to sort of contrast that, we can say that the principle that was described by Steiner in the threefold social order to underlie the cultural life was freedom. For people to be able to produce in the cultural life, they had to be free. And then he elaborated this when he talked about various things. In the economic life, the fundamental principle is brotherhood, and that's connected to the fact that there's just one earth and there's only so much stuff, and the economic life has to have its ideal in the idea of sharing. And of course, we understand that there's not always freedom in cultural life, and there's not always equality in the rights life, and there's not always brotherhood or sharing in the economic life. But in any event,